Okay, so this is a very favorite class of mine, and I've been doing it, I think this is the 4th year now in November, because it just feels like the perfect time to do it, to really start talking about the saints right before holiday time. I've had this amazing experience in the last month because I've been thinking about this class, and hi, welcome. You want to have a seat over here? Good. And then in and around that, I did a couple of Sunday services, which many of you know, and they were, the topic of the services, the last two that I gave was prayer. That was the topic. And it's interesting when you start looking around to read things about prayer, all of the saints that we would talk about in this class and have talked about over the years, that's who comes up. Next week we'll talk about Saint Teresa of Avila, and she was really known as the saint who prayed. She felt her whole life was a living prayer. And of course tonight I'm talking about Saint Francis, who's just become a favorite being, an essence in my life. But I've been able to really surround myself with their energy, even just to be able to give those Sunday services. What is, of course, what we would all know to be true, but what is so beautiful about this is that these mystics, these particular saints that we're talking about, are so deeply and completely attuned with the energy on our path. Everything that we know to be true about Ananda. Last year I went with a group of people, many of you know this already. We went to Italy, and I spoke a lot about it last year. The week after I got back, this class happened. So I was able to talk about St. Francis right out of Assisi. Very powerful. I had never been to Italy, and so obviously had never been to Assisi. What was so incredible to me about being there, in ways that are far beyond anything I could really describe, was that Francis was as alive and present in Assisi at the time that we were there as he was in the year 1200. And I felt it. It was very clear what it meant to be walking in those streets and to be feeling his energy right along with us. It wasn't like you had to think of a time past. It was like you were there and he was there. Nothing about Assisi has changed, nothing. The original cobblestones are there. When you go to the San Damiano Church, which is where the famous story, I'm sure many of you know it, but in case you don't, I'll just fill in a little bit. Francis was born in the late 1100s. I'm going to back up to fill in this story about San Damiano. And he was born as the son of a wealthy merchant. So he came in to money. And that was very important at the time. You know, if we remember what was going on at the time, not only of the Crusades and, I mean, just the whole, everything was happening then. One of the things that was happening is that shipping was just getting to be a big thing. So the whole trade system was just starting in a way like it had never been before. So people were able to trade now. They were able to have cloths and dyes and jewels and things that they would not have had access to from other countries. And people were, as you might imagine, thrilled with that. It was new. It was an extraordinarily materialistic time, is really what I'm trying to say. People were quintessentially into things and acquiring things. Human life was cheap. Human labor was cheap. We were still in a feudal system at the time. And what people cared about is the wealth that they amassed. So he did not come in really thinking about God, knowing about God. He was always a good man as a young man. He basically really loved to throw a good party, but with a real spirit of generosity. That's what he did. He had the money, so he could do it. He was always entertaining. He would buy his friends the best wine, the best food. Parties would go on all night, every night. Not not the way they talk about partying these days, but real in the spirit of having a great time and being with friends. And it was also a different time in the sense that if you walked into a shop, it's not like what we do here. You walk in and you buy something and you leave. That's a lot of where people would socialize. That's a lot of how people came together. You still see this in many places. I know for many years when I went to India, I felt that. You would go into a shop and it was an event. It was not just to buy something. You would sit down, you could be offered tea, you would say a little prayer. I mean, it's really what it was like. Minus the prayers, that's what was going on in Assisi at the time. And Francis, because he was so gregarious and so good with people, he was a big part of his father's success. And his father was a real mercenary. I mean, it's just really all he cared about. The mother was a woman who lived according to her heart, but there was no real religion in the house. So Francis had no upbringing in terms of God. He never thought about God. It was just not an issue for him. But he had a vision one day, literally a vision where he saw a palatial structure. And in that structure were all of these suits of armor made out of pure gold. And on every suit of armor was a sign of the cross. And it came to him as an inspiration. He thought, that he was supposed to go and fight. That's what he thought when he saw the cross on these suits of armor. So he actually went home and told his parents he was leaving, that he was going to go into this battle. I forget whether it was in Perugia or where it was. Doesn't matter. On the way to fight, he heard a voice that said to him, basically, you've misunderstood the message that I sent to you. Yours is a battle that will be fought at the level of the soul. It will be fought and won at a soul level, not in this physical world. And Francis said to this voice, well, what am I supposed to do? And God said to him, just go home and pray, and I will tell you what to do. Francis had never thought about God, but it was so clear to him in that moment. The way it is, many of you have heard me say this, all of my adult life as I've been speaking, people have often asked me, and it's, of course, a very good question. I've asked the same question. How do you know when it's really God who's speaking to you? How do you know when it's your intuition and not your ego? Because it's so subtle. And how many times, let me just think, this happened yesterday. Let me see if I can pull this story back. I can't quite get it exactly where it was. It might come to me. But somebody had a sequence of 2 or 3 events, and they said to me, oh, I'm sure this is a sign from God. This happened, and this happened, and that happened. It was a totally worldly experience that they were looking to solve. It could have been something like what house to buy or what job to take, but it wasn't that. But whatever it was perfectly clear to me when they were speaking that it was not a divine inspiration, but rather really some circumstantial evidence. We all do that. I'm not making fun of the person. I'm saying it's very easy to put these sequences together and say, oh, this is God talking to me. Now I know what I'm supposed to do. It's extremely difficult to get clear about when we really are receiving divine inspiration. Now, I don't know who else in this room has felt that has actually happened to them. Maybe everybody. But for me, the few times that I know it's happened, the one thing that makes it perfectly clear to me is that I know something in a moment beyond a doubt. Now, that doesn't happen very often, and it never happens when the mind's involved. It's virtually impossible because it's the mind's job to doubt things and to question it and to sort of throw challenges in your way. Oh, you think you really want to do this? Let me just show you why that may not work. Oh, go ahead, it's probably a good idea. Oh, but what if? Yes, I'd love to do it. I was working with a client today who's going through a very painful and difficult divorce. And he was telling me that he feels paralyzed because part of why he feels paralyzed is he just can't believe how mean this woman who he spent so many years with is being to him, which is the truth, she is. And that is always just shocking. But beyond that, he's saying, well, how would I know what to do? How do I know where I'm going to be working in a few months? How do I know if I'm still going to want to own my home? How do I know if I'll even stay in the area in a year? How can I move if I don't know those things? And I said to him, you can't possibly know those things right now. It's impossible. But you watch his mind trying to figure it out and getting it clear, but it won't happen. It's going to be very confusing. But when something comes to you and you know without a doubt that it's true and you never look back, and if you've had the experience, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, you'll love it when you do. But it's because it's so relieving to be out of that push-pull of life. It's so unbelievably relieving to just know something and move on and not look back. That's exactly what happened to Francis in that moment. He wouldn't have put that many words to it, but he was going off to war when he saw the first visualization without a question. And as soon as he heard God speaking to him, he knew that it was the truth, and he went home. So I was starting to tell you about San Damiano because not long after that, he started immediately having, literally on a daily basis, God would start talking to him and directing him. And things just came to him, and he knew almost always exactly what he was supposed to do. When he went to San Damiano, and he was at the church, which had been abandoned many years before and was in really a state of bad need of repair, God spoke to him, again, in a voice. He just heard God talking all the time, which, by the way, I should say, because I was saying I've had intuitive things that I know are correct. I've never heard God speaking to me. But there are other ways that we can know things. And God said to him that famous line, Francis, repair my church. That's your work in this life. And he didn't know. He literally thought God meant repair this building. And so in an extraordinary turn of events, he started literally carrying every piece of rock. He literally, rock by rock, piece of, I don't think they were using glass, whatever he was making the windows out of, everything, yes, stained glass, of course. He did it all by himself, literally single-handedly. So I was telling you that story because when you're there and you're at San Damiano and you come upon this place, you realize that every square inch of this church has been touched by Francis, has been prayed over by Francis. It is very compelling. Before I went to Italy, Devarshi, Swami Devarshi from the village called me, and he said to me, it's going to be crowded when you're there because the only reason everybody goes to Assisi is to be close to Francis. There's nothing, there's many little shops there and little restaurants, but there's nothing else that would really, it's not like you're in Florence and you're going shopping in Florence or in Rome. Not like that. Tiny little shops on these little narrow cobblestone streets. But everybody goes there. It's a spiritual pilgrimage for people. It's extraordinary. And Devarshi said to me, if you go around to the back of the church, nobody ever goes to the back. So he said, you'll be able to go to the back and you'll be able to meditate for as long as you want. And so I had to say to people that I was there with, I'm going to the back of the church, so nobody worried, and just sat down and meditated for 3 hours, like went by in a moment. Everything about this area, everything that this man ever touched, just can bring you to extraordinary states of inspiration. When we were, this is not about me, by the way, this is about the place. When we were up in Laverna, which I've said to many, and I'll say again now, is probably the holiest place I've ever been in my life. And I think many people feel that way. And Laverna is where Francis received the stigmata. He literally stood in front of a cross, which is still there as well, the very cross. And he sat there and he said to Jesus over and over and over, I want to feel all of the love and all of the pain that you ever felt. I want to know you like that. I want to be you. And that's when he received the stigmata. The rock that he was sitting on when that happened is still right there. I mean, here we are, more than 1,200 years later, and it's sitting there. And what they've done is they've covered it with a little piece of glass, and they keep a light there all the time. And I had this amazing, these are the kind of miracles that happen there. All because he's there. He is right there. These hallways that you have to walk down to get to this room are not supposed to open until, I don't remember what time, but sometime in the morning. But I didn't know that, fortunately. So I woke up early that morning and I walked over to the main basilica, the main church. Laverna sits on top of a mountain, on top of an actually rather high mountain. And in the last third of Francis's life, there was a very wealthy count who owned the mountain. And he gave Francis the mountain because he was told, the count was told, that Francis needed a place to seclude. And it just happened, of course, perfectly, literally. I mean, we know this. This is all documented. At a time where Francis had trained now the order, the Franciscan order, which was not called the Franciscan order at the time. He called it the minor order because he was always trying to minimize everything about himself. But anyway, it was so large by this time. It was so, within just a number of years, grew from 5 people. The first time Francis set out with these 5 people who had joined him, he said, right now we're few, but don't let that concern you at all. We will become the multitude, which of course they did. But people thought Francis was totally crazy. At a time where all people cared about was material wealth, he just gave away everything. He gave away that which was his. He gave away some which was his father's. I mean, and he suffered for it. And I'm going to tell you that story in a little bit. But he just didn't care. And he was trying to stand up and say to people, really, exactly what Jesus was trying to say to the Jews. The exact same message. You are a great people. You know about God, but you're missing the point now. You're being drawn away by the idea of money, and in the case of the Jews, which you've all heard many times, their rabbis had now become their kings, and they wanted money. And the system became corrupt, and it simply couldn't work, and it's exactly what was happening in Francis's time. And, a prayer of love went up from earth, and they responded, as we say every Sunday, and Francis appeared. So I awakened at Laverna, and I decided I would go and walk down this hall and try and get into this little room where Francis had received the stigmata. It's one of many places there, but just a tiny little room. So when I got there, there were 2 nuns going in, and I just walked in with them, and nobody else was there, and I couldn't believe it. And I went, I meditated for about a half hour, then I went and I put my head on that glass. I literally kneeled down in front of it and put my head on the glass. And 3 hours later, people started coming into this little room. It only holds about 20, just a tiny little chapel. I had no idea where that time had gone, and I was never supposed to be in there, but I just arrived right there, right at the moment when the nuns opened the door, and they didn't want to say to me, don't come, but it was very sweet. After I got up, the nuns each went and they laid their heads down there. It was so charming. It's like we all were sharing the same experience. Again, not about me or about them, but what it means to really take yourself to a holy place. And that's what happens anywhere in that area with anything that Francis touched. What I started to say a while ago that was so compelling for me is that when I was in Assisi, and most of you know I've really been with Ananda since the late 70s. I took a little 8-year break to go to India with another teacher for 8 years. It was all perfect and wonderful. Then I came back and moved into the community, and I've been there ever since. So it's been a beautiful Ananda sandwich, and the filling wasn't bad either. But so I'm very attuned to these masters and to this path, and it's perfect for me. I just can't fathom being anywhere else. And I can't go into many places. You know, it's like trying to listen to acid rock these days. It's just not going to work. You know, I've just like brought my energy into a different vibration. And that's the way it is with the whole spiritual path. Once you've been around for a while and it's your path, maybe you don't even have to be around for a while. The minute you know it's yours, it's almost like you come into the vibration of it. I never felt out of place in Assisi. Never. I never felt like I was anywhere other than right in Ananda. You know, Master said that St. Francis was his patron saint. And I really could feel why when I was there. Because, and I'm going to tell you some of these stories. Some of the parallels that I decided to do this year about things that Francis said and things that Master or Swamiji said. Of course, you know, the other thing that I learned, and from reading these years about some of these Christian saints, because I didn't know anything about them. You know, I was born and raised Jewish, and then I was at Ananda, and that's what my life has been. So I didn't know, maybe some of you learned a lot more about these saints than I did. But the saints that I've read about now, Saint Teresa, and Saint Francis in particular, but any of the people who were true saints, there were several Saint Teresas actually. They're all telling us the same exact thing. So it's not a big jump from our teachings to their teachings. What varies, and what we've heard Asha say so many times, and everybody on this path says, each teacher comes at a time and teaches in the way that the people can hear it. So for me growing up, whenever I heard about St. Francis, I thought he was a lunatic. The little bit I knew about him, because, you know, he was so severe in a way. That's what he looked like. He was so, in my mind, so harsh about everything. I don't feel that way about him now, but the truth is that from the moment his father took him to court, is what happened. When Francis was told to rebuild San Damiano, he just did everything he could do to get the money to rebuild the church, including going into his father's shop, buying a lot of cloth, taking it to the next town, selling it all for the church. You could imagine it didn't thrill his father. The other thing he did in the next town, which he was ecstatic about, is he sold his horse. And he kind of came back and he was ecstatic and saying to everybody, look how much money I have. And my God, I was even able to sell my horse. It reminded me, when I was rereading that story last night, about the saint, and I don't know his name, many of us have heard this story, who was just living in an ecstatic place all the time. So he would go out and all of the village kids would make fun of him because he was in a state of ecstasy. He looked crazy to them. And they would throw stones at him and mud at him. And he would get back to his little village and everybody would say, how was your day, Master? And he would say, oh, it was so wonderful. All of these kids were playing with me and they were throwing stones my way. And it was just so sweet because that's what he saw. He saw God in everyone. He saw joy everywhere. He could not see any evil or anger. It was impossible. That's exactly how Francis was. People were throwing old food in his face. They were stomping on his, tripping him when he was carrying stones. They thought he was crazy. He never saw any of it. So he's kind of dancing through the streets saying, look how well I did. And his father became enraged and took him to court. But when he went into court, I I don't know, they weren't judges in those days, but whatever they were, constables or something, was so taken with his sincerity that it opened his heart to Francis immediately. And his father said, I want you to give me back all of what you took. And Francis said, not only will I give you that back, but I will give you everything you've ever given to me. And right there in the court, he stripped naked and gave his father all the clothes on his back, other than he had put on a hair shirt, one of these, something that was very rough and that would irritate him. Because he did have a thing about wanting to suffer. He did, for a lot of reasons. Again, he was coming in countering a time that was about comfort. It was all about comfort and having material things to make you more comfortable. One of the ways that he taught his monks, one of the things that he said, that Master has said and Swamiji has said many times in their teachings, is the way Francis said it, is there is no room for any softness. Any time that you tempt yourself with any softness in the world, you will be drawn right back out into that delusion. Now, Master didn't tell us that. He wasn't telling us to suffer. In fact, what was his famous saying about Francis? He said, Francis taught about lady poverty. He said, I'll teach about lady simplicity. So he made that distinction. He wasn't asking any of us to be that extreme. But of course, again, he was in the US in the 1930s and 40s, very different time. But in that court that day, it was so wonderful. That's when Francis said to his father, until now I have called you Father, but now for sure I know my Father who art in heaven is my real Father. One of his very famous moments of realization. So, I was saying to you about that similarity. You remember the story that Swami tells about visiting the place in Scotland that was all about vegetarian and organic. What is it? Findhorn. Yeah, exactly. And he knew the founder of it, and I'm blocking on all these names right now, but he was friends with him. The man who started Findhorn and was running it said to Swami once when he was visiting him at Ananda, and they were talking about how easy it is to get drawn away from the path, how much there is that pulls on us. And he said to Swami, we were putting down a cement driveway at Findhorn. He said, we worked on it all day. We were very close to finishing it. And my wife called me in to eat. And I really didn't want to stop and eat, but she kept insisting. And so finally, we put down our tools and we went in to eat. And he said, that was 10 years ago. We've never finished the driveway. I mean, it was just an adorable story to be able to hold on to about how easy it is to be drawn out into the world. And that's part of why Francis was saying to all of his monks all of the time, and then to Claire, this is another very interesting thing about him. He said, he didn't use these words, I'm going to use our words now, but the spiritual path, he would say the love of Jesus, is not just meant for single men. He said we have to have room here for women who want to know Christ the way we do. It was probably a first in 1,000 years, if not more. I mean, quite frankly, the Jewish people who were the religious leaders 1,100 years before Francis was born, I mean, until this day in Orthodox shuls, the women and the men cannot be together. In fact, the women, honestly, in Orthodox shuls, not in Reformed or Conservative, they have no voice or no role. So this thing of women not being able to love God in the same way is ancient. And Francis just came in and said, absolutely not. Which, of course, Master said, which, of course, Swami took it the next degree with families and bringing our spiritual path so that it's available to anyone. I mean, look at all of us here. None of us are monks or nuns in this room. So it's interesting, but Francis did that. As soon as he met Claire and saw how purely about God she was, he recognized her, and he started a whole order for women. Now, I will say, they were the definition of cloistered. When you go to the, where is it, Portiuncula, that's where it is, and which was Francis's favorite place in all of Italy. That's where he loved spending time the most, and Claire too. But the nuns were kept upstairs in these rooms, and the only way that you could get up there was to climb this ladder and go in through this little window. So anybody who had a delivery would just climb the ladder and put things in through the window. Francis told his monks that they should never, ever have anything to do with a woman at all. Eye contact, nothing, other than if they were doing confession. If the women wanted to come to them for confession, and he said, still don't look in their eyes. He said the pull, P-U-L-L, is so strong that in ways that you can't imagine, you will be drawn out of yourself. And it really can be. Now remember, he was speaking to people who had really seriously renounced everything in the world. He said, it's too dangerous. And you remember the story where Swamiji was opening a door for one of the much older nuns at Lake Shrine, or Mount Washington. And Swami was in his early 20s, right, when he was with Master. And one of the nuns, I think she was in her 60s, was like a grandmother to him. And Master called him later and said, you shouldn't do that. And he said, but she's an old woman. And she had all these packages. And Master said, it doesn't matter. You know, she'll do it. You, as a monk, should have nothing to do with women. Now, I'm sure there was also, he always knew who he was speaking to, and the messages he delivered were personal in many ways. But he also made that very clear to all of the monks all of the time. And then there was Francis. I'm just speaking these stories to you as they come up, that you can see, you know, truth is really one, is what it's about. It's interesting that the vibration also feels so good. But somebody asked me last year when I was giving this class, and I forgot to ever find out, would we call Francis an avatar? And I don't really know the answer to that. I mean, how could I know? But what difference would it make to me? I mean, he was St. Francis. He's so far beyond anything I could imagine. I'd certainly be bowing at his feet. And I wondered, I thought, could somebody receive the stigmata and not be an avatar? I don't know. I mean, I have no idea what that word means. But so when you think of somebody who is just that great, I just want to find these other. I just made all of these lists about the ways that the path is so similar, and I just wanted to keep talking about them. One big difference, of course, with these that is very interesting and glaring is that somehow Francis didn't come in knowing who he was, which I find just fascinating. Of course, Master did. And I mean, Swamiji was having superconscious dreams from the time he was a tiny little boy. But Master came in, you remember Master's comment, taking on a new body is like putting on a heavy winter coat on a summer day. I mean, so he remembered it right from the beginning. But Francis didn't. Yeah, that was an interesting thing. You're right. I mean, the Buddha was exactly the same way. We don't know what he was thinking as a little boy, but it seems like he was just the usual little boy, right? In that whole castle where he was kept. Yeah, I think that's really right. Whatever inspired him at the time it did to need to go out has always intrigued me. I mean, obviously God was just calling to him. It was just his time. But yeah, it's an interesting thing when people get to it so much later. But, you know, I mean, and then people we know to be avatars. Of course, Master told Swamiji that he would attain full self-realization. His last test would be death in this life. But anyway, yeah, so obviously you're right. There's the Buddha that did it too. This, what we all know about Francis was this extraordinary connection that he had with animals. I mean, it's such a big part. You rarely see a picture of Francis where you don't see him with animals, and there are so many amazing stories. You know, there's this very great book. I put a marking on this book every time there was a similarity in their teaching, so every page is marked. But this book by St. Bonaventure, I don't know who did the translation, but the translation is brilliant. And this book was written, he was 11 years old when Francis died. But it's a beautiful book. It reads like a novel. That's how easy it is to just pick it up. And the title is The Life of St. Francis. It's called Bonaventure, The Life of St. Francis. He writes in poetry, which is amazing to me because I was never somebody who was great at getting the depth of the meaning of poetry. It was not my thing. But when you pick up this book and you read his poetry, he's written about the whole life, Francis's whole life. Then, of course, he comments on it. But every chapter starts with this 2 or 3 page long poem, and it's just an exquisite book. But why I'm telling you about it is because I often wonder when we're looking back historically, and I feel so grateful, which I think everyone has heard me say, or almost everyone, that our guru lived until 1952. We don't have to have any questions about what he was saying. You know, it's written, he's on tape, we hear his words. It's not, you know, all we needed was an interpreter. And we got it with Swami Kriyananda, who also lived with him, who could come in and tell us what Master meant and what these teachings mean. So that's easy. But when you're trying to really understand what Moses was saying or what Jesus was saying, very challenging. Talking about something that was thousands of years ago. They didn't even speak a language that we could understand. I mean, it's extremely complicated for me because I don't trust people's interpretation of those works, because so few people have had an experience of those works that it's just left to their mind. One of the things that Francis said over and over and over to every time he spoke to a crowd in as many ways as he could is, this is nothing you're going to learn through study. Forget the study, which how many times have we heard that? This is a knowing of the heart. This is a realization of something. He uses these words, literally. He often uses the same words that Master did. It's very affirming to me to look over thousands of years and find these amazing masters telling us exactly the same thing. I think it's really what helped me onto my spiritual path. You know, I used to say to people, 30 years ago, when I would be speaking to a group of medical people, when I was still making that mistake of trying to help medical people see how spirituality and medicine could come together. But I used to say to them, what would you make of this? You read these books on comparative religion, the thousands of years and thousands of miles apart, people are saying the same thing. How can you doubt it? They didn't collude against us or say, hey, let's fool these people. Obviously, they were perceiving a reality. And when you read, not just this book, I mean, there's the wonderful book, what is the name of that big fat book? The Saints Who knows that book? The Saints Who, what the world, something. Moved the world, that's exactly right, thank you, Eric. The Saints Who Moved the World, and I think there's about 6 chapters on them. But I mean, that's another fabulous book about a lot of these Christian saints. But when you read these books, you just realize that they're all saying the same thing, but again, you need an interpreter. I don't know how Bonaventure wrote this, but he lived at the time of Francis, and he keeps saying in this book that there were always witnesses and that he interviewed all of these witnesses, a lot of the many people in the order who were with him. So when I hear them quoting something that's precisely, exactly how Master said it. You know, it's just, it really gets me. Was anybody in this class last year? No. So I told you I came right out of Italy into this class. And I had this experience in Italy. When I got to Italy, my suitcase did not arrive. And it didn't arrive for the first 5 or 6 days that we were there. Now I can't remember. I was sort of happy about it because I don't know, instantly I was happy about it. I just was, wow, this is so easy. I don't have one decision to make. You know, I don't even have to think about what I'm going to put on tomorrow because I literally had what I had on my back and my purse. That was all I had. Most other people on the trip were quite upset about it. People who were half my size kept insisting I borrow their clothes. And I think, oh yeah, that's what I want to do is just pour myself into a size 2 of something, you know. I mean, it was crazy. But I was totally at ease. But when they left to leave Rome and go on to Florence, I wouldn't leave Rome till my bag came because I knew that bag was going to show up in a day or two. And I figured it would follow me all over Europe. Otherwise, I didn't want that. So much to Anand's surprise, he kept saying, really? You're going to leave this trip to wait for your suitcase? But I was so longing for time alone. This trip, it turned out, was 50 people. I was like, oh yeah, I'm waiting right here. We were staying in a huge ancient convent, you know, right above St. Peter's Square. It was actually gorgeous, but you couldn't appreciate it with all, I couldn't, with all 50 people there. Well, everything was perfect. My bag did come 2 days later, and then I was able to get on a train by myself and meet them in Florence, except that when my bag came, my black boots and 2 cashmere sweaters had been stolen from my bag. Now, I didn't need them in Assisi, that was for sure, but I was going on to spend a week in Paris. And I had brought one dress and these black boots to wear in Paris every day. And I got into this thing. So I was reading all these books about the saints, this is the point of it, and how easy it is to get lured into the world, and all of this wisdom. And I get to Florence. I mean, does everybody in this room know that it is one of the 2 or 3 fashion centers of the world? It's like everything starts in Florence and Rome and Paris. That's it. It's really the truth. And I get it in my head that I have to have a new pair of black boots. It's so embarrassing that I did this. But you know, so I would go and meditate for 2 or 3 hours in the morning in these exquisite abbeys. I just can't describe them to you. We were all having this experience. These masses, they were all in Italian. I mean, I didn't speak a word of Italian. I don't know one word of Italian right now. The masses were all, of course, in Italian, for the Italians. And not only that, I had never been to a mass, ever in my life, other than a couple of midnight masses as a kid, because everybody said, come, it's beautiful, so I would go into a church for midnight mass on Christmas Eve, but I never liked it. But you know, when we were there with these masses, I always knew what they were talking about. You could just tell what part of the Bible. Now, of course, we study the Bible all the time, and we all know the Bible. And, you know, I don't know anything about that, really, but I knew it. And everybody did. It was just that. So I'm saying to you, this is how profound these experiences were, and I would leave them, and I would get pulled into the next shoe store. It was unbelievable. I want to tell you something. I bought these pair of black boots. It was the most ridiculous purchase I have ever made in my life. They were seriously expensive. And they were like what is now the rage here. But it was more than a year ago. So they had these black boots with studs on them. Now, what was I thinking? I'm going to come back here and mostly be in white at Ananda. I mean, it was... Jyotish says to me when I get back to the hotel, Jyotish, I want to see your boots. I said to him, no. He said, why? I'd love to see the boots. And all of a sudden it hit me, Shanti, what is wrong with you that you can't show Jyotish these boots? I never showed anybody the boots. I never put the boots on my feet. As soon as I got home, they went on to Craigslist and they left for about 10% of what I paid for them. You know, I'm telling you this story, I am not proud of it, but it's absolutely the truth. In the midst of one of the most profound spiritual experiences I've ever had, I'm buying studded black boots. I mean, this world is so filled with delusions, you know. I mean, it's so humbling to get it. And when I kept reading, and then I came home and I immediately gave this class, I said, I have to tell the people the truth. I can't just say, this was the holiest trip I've ever taken, and now I'm here teaching you all about the saints. I mean, it was absurd. I should have worn the black boots to the class. It was so ridiculous. Well, believe me, I could tell a lot of stories on myself. That's only one. But it's so absurd, and it keeps coming up because it happened right there, right in the middle of having, you know, I really seriously considered never coming back here. I just did because here's the other thing that I'm not sharing with you that's not really at all about Francis. You know, Swami Kriyananda had his own house at a CC, at Ananda CC. Ananda CC's not like what we have here. There's a retreat center. People come, and there's a few rooms in a couple buildings, and there's some cabins that people can stay in when they go there on the land. But the people who are Ananda Assisi don't live there. So there's this huge radius of buildings. I don't know, I said 40 miles, but I have no idea. I mean, out into the hills. These are the hills of Umbria. It's out in the country where they all have their own homes. And so it's like a car ride, and then some for everybody to come in. But Swami you could walk down this little road and go to his house, or most people would drive, but you know, it was a pretty easy little walk. He loved that house. He loved that house, and it was where he would do the most secluding. And he died in that house. He left his body there, as we all know. And so that was in April. Do I have my years right? Swami died in 2013. So we were there 6 months later. I don't think it matters. I don't even know why I'm telling you the time, because I'm going back to Italy next summer, and I'm certain it's going to feel this way. And that is that Swamiji is in that house. He is right there. I don't understand why it feels different there than it does at the village or here, other places that he spends so much time, but it really does, and everybody knows it. We all are having this experience of feeling more in touch with Swamiji. I say we're all, that's ridiculous. Many people have said they feel closer to Swamiji since he left his body, and many people have profound experiences when he was leaving and after he left. And I certainly feel very close to him everywhere, but there's something about it there. So I just didn't mention that, but I have to mention it. It's a huge part of that whole experience is that Master Swamiji and Francis are all right there, all exactly teaching. So I got to that story about the boots because, it's so absurd and compared to all of this. But when Francis was teaching everybody, and when Master was saying it to Swamiji, and I could tell you that story about the man from Findhorn, it's so easy to get pulled away from our paths and how diligent we need to be. Not that we're all wanting to live like Franciscan monks. We aren't all. It's not for all of us, or like Claire and her nuns. But to whatever degree we want to be on a path, wherever that is for each of us, there's no judgment there. The point is still that to stay where you are and to stay on track, it takes energy. And that's really what Francis came to try and say to everybody, and why he had to. I don't think I ever finished this story, but when he took those clothes off of his back in the church, the constable, or whatever that man was called at the time, said to somebody, go and get him something to put on immediately. He immediately started treating him like a great man of God, which is often what he was called, the great man of God. And they brought out this burlap sack that had been left there by a farmer or somebody. And Francis put it on, and they gave him a piece of rope, and he put it around his waist, and that's all he ever wore. That is all he ever wore. He lived in the hills in Italy. They have winter and snow. I mean, really serious snow. He would occasionally put on little open sandals, but it's really cold there. And he never, there's stories of him, I was telling you before how he used to get beaten up and teased, and very often people would throw him down a hill or throw him into a ditch that would be filled with snow, and he'd be naked, and he'd be in the snow. But then the other monks would say, they watched it happen, but as they went to run to get him, they would see this huge light surrounding the area where he was. And he would say to them, I never felt cold. I'm just filled with this heat of divine love. It was, it reminded me of when Asha has said many times about Swamiji, and it's clearly the truth, but she put it to words so beautifully, that she realized many years ago, it wasn't like Swamiji was trying to be nice or trying to be thoughtful or he just was those things. There was no effort. We might need to, I tell people my famous story of this spiritual epiphany with my husband and how I decided I would only see God. And ever since then, I've been trying every day to only see God. That's somebody sort of humbly making an effort. That's very different than naturally seeing God in everyone. It's just not where I am yet. But for Francis, he really didn't feel pain, just like Swamiji didn't have to try, or Master, or any of the masters. Every story we read about where they can really transcend all of that. So he wasn't suffering in the way that we think of suffering. Just like when we try and imagine what did Jesus feel on the cross, how could we know? Somebody who could come and go from their body at will. How do we know what he felt? We would have no idea. We say, I even almost caught myself saying it before, when Francis said in front of Jesus, I want to know all of the love, the depth of the love, the extent of the love, and all of the pain that you felt. And he received the stigmata, because everybody always says it's painful. And I think Saint Teresa does say that it was painful when she received the stigmata. But Francis never said it. I have no idea if he was feeling pain or what he was feeling. But he had to say to his monks, this is just how austere you need to be, because the times were such that they would be pulled out. I started to talk to you about his relationship with animals, and that's when I got sidetracked, because I wanted to say there were so many witnesses to it, that we don't have to wonder. Bonaventure keeps talking about how he went and he would hear stories he would collect data from many different monks to verify these stories. But things would happen to him like, there are many famous stories, but there was a cricket that used to come at the Portiuncula and sing, and Francis had a relationship with this cricket. And for some reason, he wanted the cricket there. But after about 3 months, one day, he just said to the cricket, you're done here now. It's time for you to move on. And the cricket would just leave, and it was never seen again. There were birds that were known, like larks, he mentions, that larks apparently they only come out at dawn and in the daylight. I'm pretty sure I don't have it backwards, but it wouldn't matter. But if Francis would be giving a sermon, the larks would come no matter what time of day it was. And people swore that they would sit there. He would say to them, if they started singing, you really need to be quiet now. I'm preaching the word of God. And they would just totally get quiet. People said the birds would sit there and look at him with their mouths open and listen. And when he was all done, he would say to them, okay, you can sing now. And they would start singing the way birds do. I mean, one experience after another with these animals. And, because I'm doing this comparative religion class tonight, it so reminded me of stories of Master, not about animals, although there are those stories like the deer that one needed to die, and Master couldn't let him go. And finally the deer said to Master, you're holding me back. Master realized he was too attached and he had to let him go. But remember when Master said to somebody who he was talking to, the man was questioning, Master said, you have a very sour taste in your mouth right now, don't you? And the man was like, how did you know that? Or when Master said, I never remember, it's hard for me to remember which body I'm in, when he would stumble sometimes and fall. I mean, you hear all of these stories about these saints, and I think that's what Francis was exhibiting. That was part of his lesson that he came to show us, is that God is in everyone and everything. He had other miracle stories, like a man who came to him who had been walking for miles, and he said to him, I'm going to die of thirst, literally. And Francis said, just go over and wait by that rock. And then the man was able to lift up the rock and just drink water from it. And Francis had his story of turning water into wine when they needed more wine. So I mean, these, what we would call miracles before, but which we now know are simply a matter of transforming energy. Not that I can do that, but you can understand how the saints can do it. But you just feel this flow of how similar life was for Francis and how it was for Master and how it was for Jesus, even though it all looks so different. And it's just fascinating because when I first read this book and I started writing in the margins the way I do, it started coming to me every story. I would say, oh, this is a story right out of the Bhagavad Gita, or this is a story about Master when he did whatever, or stories about Swami. All of our stories would come to me, they were exactly analogous. Does anybody have any comments or questions or anything? I'm going to take a water break here. Nothing. One of the really big points that Francis, he was very humble. It's a very interesting thing. Well, humility was I think it was one of the cornerstones of his church, of course. So there was an understatement to say he was very humble. He was humility. But he often asked the other monks to help him solve a problem. So he would say to them, what do you think about this? What should I do? I could take off into the hills and pray, and through my prayer, I know that I could affect the world, or I could stay out here and I could preach. What should I do? I mean, he was genuinely, or he presented it in a way that he genuinely felt unsure about it. What would be better? Because, of course, they're both fabulous ways for a teacher to be. And he asked them all to go home and pray, and a couple of them had dreams and came back and related their dreams to him. And then he would say, oh, there's the answer. He would know. But he said eventually, of course, he spent hours a day in prayer, but he still said eventually, you're right, I came to teach. I'm supposed to be out in the world and teaching. So he came out into the world. That really struck me yesterday because of all these talks about prayer. Again, these last 3 weeks have been all about prayer and how important it was. And he kept saying that. It's so important to pray. But what I came here to do is teach. There's a wonderful story about him. He, again, we have to remember the times. There was no transportation other than his horse, which he had sold. I mean, it just was obviously it was the early 1200s now, the very early. Francis died in his 40s, which is pretty interesting that he died such a young man. Of course, people did die younger then, but who knows what God had in mind, but he was so austere with his body. He was often very, very sick and in a lot of pain. But he had one of his missions was always to when he wrote what he called the rule, which became the Franciscan order, he wanted to take it to the Pope and have the Pope, what's the word that I want? He wanted the Pope to bless it and say, yes, this is something that you can teach. He wanted the Pope to put his blessing on it, really, is what it was. And the Pope knew when he got there, because he had to travel a ways to get to the Pope, that what he was hearing from Francis was the truth, but he didn't know about allowing new rules into the church. But he remembered that he had a dream about a week ago about a little man who was holding a huge building up all on his own. And as he was talking to Francis, he realized that that dream was about Francis. So he felt very torn, like, I had this dream, and this man really feels, I believe everything he's saying here is the truth, but I'm not sure what he's asking is so impossible, like to live exactly word for word by the gospel was a very literal interpretation of the Bible. So he said to Francis, go home and pray for a way to convince us. So Francis went home and he prayed not only for the argument to give to the Pope, but for the words to say it to the Pope and the Pope's bishops and everything, that they could understand it, which I really loved, because many times when I'm in my medical practice and I pray to Master, what's the answer here? What's the diagnosis? Or what do I say? It's always come to me that I would have that prayer with Master. Tell me, what do I say? But always then, tell me how to say it so that they can hear it, because that's so important, when you're trying to counsel or teach people. You can know the answer, but saying it in a way that anybody could hear it, which is just what Francis prayed for. I was so happy to read that last night. But when he went back, he had a vision, which I don't exactly remember right now, but he told the Pope, here's what came to me in my dream. And the Pope then knew for sure that it was absolutely the truth. But he said to his main council, I don't know what to do. And the main council said to him, if we deny him the right to bring these teachings into the world, then it's like blasphemy against Jesus himself, because we're saying we can't live according to the gospel. How can we do that? We have to. What he's saying is the truth anyway, but we have to do this without fear. This is such a beautiful story that he's given all of these dreams and interpretations. Reminded me of Jacob's ladder and all of these other biblical stories where it happens. But he walked to Syria, literally, to go to see the head of the Sultan, who was the head of the Muslim order at that time, because he felt inspired to try and convert him to Christianity. The Sultan had told everybody that he would give them a gold coin for every head of a Christian that they brought in. That was how barbaric the times were. You bring me the head, I'll give you a gold coin. And here, little St. Francis is about half my size probably, is walking to Syria to see the Sultan. I mean, he really did this. And when he got there, the Sultan immediately fell in love with him. He just saw him and he knew that he was the real thing. And Jesus gave him all of these arguments why he should convert to Christianity. And the Sultan saying, how can I do that? I'm the head of another religion. I can't do it. And Francis was saying to him, no, if you have the courage and you are willing to own the truth, you can do this. This is the true religion. And it was very charming. He said to Francis, I won't do it, but will you stay and have a great meal with me? And Francis would never have a meal. He wouldn't eat in anybody's home. If he was going to somebody's home, he begged first for food, which was leftovers and garbage, and he took it with him. He wouldn't let himself enjoy a meal. And boy, was I glad I didn't live at his time when I heard that. Really helps you see your attachments when you read about St. Francis, I'll tell you. They're kind of glaring, there's no subtleties here. And then he said to him, let me give you all of these riches, all of this money, then you can take them back and distribute it amongst the poor. And Francis wouldn't take it, interestingly. He said, no. He said, I only came here to help you know God. And if I can't do that, he just bowed before him and left. Everybody who met this man fell in love with him. I mean, now everybody who had any wisdom about them was able to see that he was speaking the truth. The stories are endless and charming. Oh, here's another beautiful story. I'll stop in about 10 minutes. Francis went up to the top of a mountain to receive the order, the words for the order. What should it be? What are the rules? What are the limits? What's the foundation? He wanted to hear it from God directly, which is so analogous to Moses going up. And it's just interesting how these stories repeat themselves over and over. Everybody climbs a mountain at some point, all of these avatars. But when he came down, he gave the order. So it was written. I don't know how it was written then, but it was written. He gave it to one of his newer monks. And about 2 days later, and again, these are true stories, apparently true, the monk told him he lost it. I mean, here he went up and received this inspiration. I thought to myself, there's a message you would really not want to have to deliver to God himself. I'm sorry, I lost all your rules. They said that Francis, without a pause, just went back up on top of the mountain and received it again. Isn't this beautiful? And came down with it. And then sometime later, the original one was found. This is huge. This is the entire Franciscan order written out word for word, that they were exact. I mean, when we talk about perceiving the truth or realizing the truth, this is what it means. It means no matter how many times you go back and you get into that place where you're one with God, you're going to hear exactly the same thing. These stories are just remarkable, really. Let me just see if there's anything else. Oh, yeah. I'll just share one other story with you. We'll stop then. The reason I'm going to share this story with you is because it's so adorable. He was traveling with a few of his monks, and they were very worried about how they would get food or how they would live. They were going into a territory where there was nothing. And Francis said, you have to believe in God. This can happen. Immediately, I was reminded of the story from the chapter in AY, two penniless boys from Brindaban, right? He's actually challenged by his brother to take this trip overnight, to go to another city, to eat 3 meals a day, to get a train ride there, a train ride back. You all remember the story? And to never beg for a penny. He's not allowed to ask any, this is Paramahansa Yogananda that I'm talking about now. He's not allowed to ask anybody for anything. So his brother is saying to him, his older brother, who you remember always wanted to pull him off the path, if you can do this, then I'll believe in it. But here's the rules. And Yogananda goes off, he's fearless about it. His friend was not so fearless. And it is exactly what happened to Francis. Francis is sort of saying, if you believe, we will be able to eat. And all along the way, for days, without asking for anything, same thing. People appeared. One time they said a man just ran up, gave them a loaf of bread. Not only did they appear with food, but they appeared with food that Francis would be willing to eat. Not a big warm cooked meal or something that he was going to refuse, but whatever he wanted. So let me just end now. I mean, there's hundreds of stories here. But it's a very beautiful life that he lived, even though it doesn't appear that way. Remember, I started an hour and 15 minutes ago saying I thought he was so harsh. I thought he was a madman. That's how I used to think of him. And then I could feel, as I've studied him over these years, and I think maybe more than anything, as I went to Assisi last year and really felt his presence, that this man, there's the foreword in this book is written by an author, Donna Tartt. I've read several of her books. She's really wonderful. Yeah, Susan's a reader too. If you read the introduction, you're so drawn into this book, and it's just enough to read. She was talking about how she just didn't believe in God at all, but when she read Franny and Zoe, they said Francis is more lovable than, I forget what they said, than somebody. I don't think than Jesus, because she wasn't finding Jesus very lovable, Donna Tartt, as a young child. But Francis was more lovable maybe than one of the animals or something, than Franny and Zoe. And she said she just had to find out about this character. So she really got to know Francis and, of course, just fell in love with him. I mean, you really have to. But she says in there, and she's absolutely right, she doesn't use these words now. I'm going to use, again, our words. What is so remarkable about him is that what he's teaching is Sanatana Dharma. He's teaching exactly, not that we're surprised by it, because it doesn't really matter what the year was, but in 1200, he's teaching that there are truths that underlie all great religions and that they're eternal truths. And he says in words over and over and over to the monks, just like when he went up onto that mountain twice, these teachings can't be lost. They're the only truth. You know, when Swami said once, if the whole world as we knew it were to disappear right now, you know, the way it has many times, that's what's happened. You know, the huge volcano or the meteor hitting Earth or whatever it is that's going to make it all go away. He said it wouldn't matter. As soon as there was a living being around, they would realize these truths again, because where's the truth going to go? It's always going to be there. And what she says about Francis, she says, you know, you can pick up elements of Buddhism and Sufism and all these different religions. She said, the truth is he was a big bhakti yogi. That's what she says about him. And it's really the truth. And when I first read this book, which is now many years ago, I said to myself, a bhakti yogi. Because, remember, I thought he was a madman. But he is. He is all about love, everything. He loved God so much. That's all he ever saw. He literally burned with it. You know, there was a time where he had a big abscess or something on his face. You know, medicine was so archaic in those days. It's just disgusting. You can hardly read about it. So he says they were going to cauterize it. You know, in these days, they put you to sleep and they run a little electrical cautery over something. No, they cauterized it with a branding iron. But, you know, he'd pray to the fire, and he called the fire his friend. And he said, just come and kiss my face and just be with me. I know you're God too. Just come and love me. And he never felt, they put a branding iron on his face, and they describe, I won't, for your sake, what it was like being there. But the doctor himself said, I tell you now that I have witnessed nothing less than a miracle. And he actually left his practice and went and became a Franciscan monk. I mean, this is, of course, how it happens. You see enough of these things and you realize, what else are we doing here? What else would we be doing here? I've been trying to know this love and this God. I mean, at some point, it just comes in. It's happened to all of us wherever we are. We take our next step then. The doctor's next step was to become a Franciscan monk. But it's just such an amazing story. He was the embodiment of love. And people who met him, all of the stories in the book about one by one by one, how the first 12, interestingly 12, people came to him, you know, where they just saw the miracle, felt his heart, felt inextricably drawn into his light. And so really, where would I want to leave you? I would want to leave you, the simple part of it would be read this book or watch the movies, you know, Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, because he loved the sun, he loved the moon. Again, everything was God. You can watch that movie. There's many movies. East West has several movies about Francis. The A couple of them aren't that, they vary. Let me just say that. This book is fabulous, but what I really want to say to everybody is go to Assisi. That's what I really want to say. Really go there and feel him and have this profound experience of the divine. It doesn't matter where you are. Everybody has come there to love him. When I was there, I wasn't going to bring back, I don't bring back gifts for people, but you can imagine, literally a dime a dozen, you can buy rosary beads. And some of them are very beautiful. I mean, if you're willing to spend 75 cents or $1, the beads are these gorgeous colors. And so I bought like 30 of them. And every place I went in Assisi, I put them on the altar. Even many times people would come up to me afterwards and say, no, you weren't supposed to do that. But I did. I laid them on that spot where he received the stigmata. I laid it on the spot where he left his body. I put those beads everywhere. And I came home and I gave them to people. I gave them even to many of my Jewish friends. And everybody loves those beads. Of course they do. I was just thinking to myself, what was wrong with me? I didn't even save one for myself, but I'm going back. So, it's really something to feel how that pure love for God can perfuse everything. It just becomes a part of everything that it touches, so that you bring 10-cent beads back for people and they cherish it. And they're not cherishing the beads, but they're feeling what it meant, where those beads were, and the blessing that was really bestowed upon them by this extraordinary man who loved everything so that everything was one, and nothing in the world saw him as other. Birds didn't know he wasn't a bird. The cricket didn't know he wasn't a cricket. It just goes on and on. That is what the love of God does. And he really manifested that. That was his job here, as she said, a true bhakti yogi. So, all right, everybody, thank you. Lovely.